The bright red notice taped to my grandmother's front door made my jaw clench. Final warning: unauthorized structure removal scheduled. I tore it down, watching through the window as Victoria Palmer strutted back to her pristine colonial, phone already at her ear, probably calling her HOA minions to celebrate their upcoming victory. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What Victoria didn't know was that her precious bulldozer party was about to become Exhibit A in a state-level investigation, because when you demolish a disability access ramp belonging to the grandmother of Colorado's Disability Rights Commissioner, you've made more than just a neighborhood mistake. You've created a legal nightmare for yourself. The war between my grandmother Maggie and Victoria Palmer began 6 months ago, right after Grandma's hip replacement surgery. The doctor had been clear she needed a proper wheelchair ramp to safely navigate her front entrance. Being the dutiful grandson, I immediately hired Mountain View Accessibility Contractors, a certified company specializing in ADA-compliant installations. The ramp was nothing fancy, just a standard concrete pathway with the regulation 1:12 slope ratio, textured surface for grip in Colorado's snowy winters, and the exact same earth tone color as Grandma's modest ranch house. We'd even installed small, tasteful solar-powered lights along the edges for nighttime safety. Most importantly, we'd filed all the proper city permits and received approval before construction began. But Victoria Palmer, self-appointed guardian of Willow Creek Estate's aesthetic integrity, appeared before the concrete had even set. She wore her signature pearl necklace and tailored pantsuit, designer sunglasses perched on her highlighted blonde hair as she snapped photos on her iPhone. Section 12, paragraph 7 clearly prohibits structural modifications without HOA pre-approval, she announced, not even bothering with a greeting. This will need to come down immediately. My grandmother, despite being in pain from her surgery, wheeled herself to the doorway. Victoria, I've lived in this neighborhood for 30 years. This ramp is medically necessary. Victoria's smile never reached her eyes. Rules are rules, Maggie. We all signed the same covenant when we bought our homes. I'm sure you can find one of those portable metal ramps that won't impact our community's cohesive design standard. What she conveniently ignored was that portable ramps weren't suitable for Grandma's needs, too steep, too narrow, and dangerous during Colorado's icy winters. But Victoria Palmer cared more about property values than human values. I stepped forward, explaining that we'd followed city building codes and received proper permits. Victoria just waved her manicured hand dismissively. The city isn't the HOA, James. You should know the difference. That night, I stayed up researching our rights. As the newly appointed State Disability Commissioner, I knew the Americans with Disabilities Act should protect Grandma's right to access her own home. But I wanted to handle this through proper channels, not by flashing my government credentials. This wasn't just about my grandmother. What about all the other residents who faced similar discrimination but lacked my resources? Over the next few months, the notices kept coming. First weekly, then daily. Victoria scheduled HOA meetings about eyesore structures for times when Grandma had physical therapy. When I attended in her place, Victoria claimed the meetings were postponed, only for neighbors to later tell me they proceeded without us. Mr. Diaz from next door quietly slipped me copies of the meeting minutes, showing how Victoria had established a special architectural compliance fund that seemed to have no oversight. She did the same thing when my wife needed oxygen tanks, he whispered, claimed the equipment on our porch violated Section 15 about visible medical devices. I started documenting everything, photographs, recordings of conversations, copies of all notices, and testimony from other residents. The Patel family across the street shared how Victoria had forced them to remove the wheelchair lift they'd installed for their aging father. The Thompsons down the block had been fined repeatedly for their autistic son's sensory garden. During this time, Grandma refused to let me use my position to intervene. "We do this the right way or not at all," she insisted, her nurse's training from 50 years ago still shaping her principled approach to conflict. If we bypass the system for ourselves, we're no better than Victoria. Last Tuesday, everything escalated. I was helping Grandma into her car for her doctor's appointment when I noticed Victoria in an intense discussion with two men in hard hats near the community clubhouse. They kept pointing at our house and examining what looked like blueprints. My stomach dropped as I caught fragments of their conversation. "Removal scheduled Thursday. Permit already filed. Bring the equipment early." I approached them, phone recording in my pocket. "Excuse me, is there something I should know about?" Victoria's smile was triumphant. "Oh, James, perfect timing. The board voted last night to exercise our covenant. Enforcement rights. That unauthorized ramp will be removed Thursday morning at 8 a.m. sharp." She handed me an official-looking document. "This is courtesy notification, though legally we're only required to provide 24 hours notice." "You can't be serious," I said, scanning the paper. "This is my grandmother's only way in and out of her house." "Rules are rules," Victoria repeated, her favorite phrase. "Perhaps next time you'll follow proper HOA protocols instead of city permits." She turned to the contractors. "Remember, I need everything documented with photographs for our records." That evening, I called an emergency meeting with my legal team at the State Disability Rights Commission office. We reviewed all the evidence I'd gathered and the applicable state and federal laws. My deputy director, Sophia Chen, shook her head in disbelief. "They're violating at least 6 different statutes," she said, highlighting sections of the Colorado Fair Housing Act. "But the bigger issue might be this architectural compliance fund. From what you've shown me, it looks like they're collecting targeted fines without proper accounting." We prepared all the necessary documentation for legal action, but decided to wait and see if Victoria would actually follow through with her threat. Part of me hoped she'd come to her senses. I was wrong. Thursday morning at 7:30 a.m., I was making coffee when the rumble of heavy machinery shattered the quiet. Through the kitchen window, I watched in disbelief as a yellow bulldozer rolled down our street, followed by Victoria's luxury SUV and 2 pickup trucks from Palmer Construction Services. Wait, Palmer Construction? I pulled up the company registry on my phone and confirmed what I suspected. The construction company was owned by Victoria's husband. She was using her HOA position to funnel jobs to her family business. I grabbed my phone and legal documents, racing outside just as the bulldozer operator was positioning his equipment near our ramp. Victoria stood nearby in a crisp white pantsuit, clipboard in hand, directing workers like a symphony conductor. "Stop right now," I shouted, positioning myself between the machinery and our ramp. "This is illegal." Victoria sighed dramatically. "James, we've been over this. The HOA has every right to remove non-compliant structures. We've given you multiple warnings and ample time to comply." "I have here," I held up our folder, "city permits, documentation of medical necessity, and evidence that this removal violates federal accessibility laws." Her smile never faltered. "The HOA covenant supersedes. No covenant supersedes federal law," I interrupted, my voice steady. "And no HOA president should be awarding demolition contracts to her husband's company without disclosing the conflict of interest." That finally cracked her composure. "How dare you imply—" By now, neighbors were emerging from their homes, many still in bathrobes and slippers. Mr. Diaz had his phone out, recording everything. The Patels stood on their porch, whispering urgently. Even the normally reclusive Thompson family had come outside to watch. Victoria regained her poise, addressing the growing crowd. "Everyone, please return to your homes. This is a standard covenant enforcement proceeding." She turned to the bulldozer operator. "Continue as planned." The machine lurched forward, its metal blade scraping the pavement as it approached our ramp. My heart hammered, but I stood my ground, continuing to record everything. "Mrs. Palmer," I said loudly, making sure everyone could hear, "as a final warning, I must inform you that destroying this wheelchair ramp constitutes discrimination under the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Fair Housing Act. Additionally, you are about to be recorded violating Colorado Revised Statute 3833-3209. 5. Regarding HOA governance." She rolled her eyes. "Save your legal jargon for someone who cares. Mark," she called to the bulldozer operator, "proceed immediately." The blade connected with the edge of our ramp with a sickening crack, sending chunks of concrete scattering across our lawn. The lights we'd carefully installed shattered. I felt physically ill watching the destruction, but kept recording as evidence. What Victoria and her crew failed to notice was the black government SUV turning onto our street. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Followed by a Channel 9 news van. I texted my deputy director when the bulldozer first arrived, implementing our emergency response plan. The bulldozer had demolished about a quarter of the ramp when Sophia Chen stepped out of the SUV, accompanied by 2 state housing inspectors and our legal counsel. A reporter and cameraman emerged from the news van, equipment already rolling. Victoria was so focused on the destruction that she didn't notice the newcomers until the reporter called out, "Mrs. Palmer, Channel 9 News, can you comment on why you're demolishing a state-approved disability access ramp?" She spun around, her face transforming from triumph to confusion. "This is private HOA business. You have no right to be here." That's when I finally revealed what I'd been holding back. I stepped forward, my state identification badge visible on my suit lapel. "Victoria Palmer, I'm James Wilson, Colorado, State Disability Rights Commissioner. This demolition is now officially under state investigation for violations of accessibility laws, discriminatory housing practices, and potential misappropriation of HOA funds." The color drained from Victoria's face as she looked from me to the news camera, to the state officials now examining what remained of our ramp. "You're... what? You can't just... I'm also serving you with this emergency cease and desist order," I continued, handing her the document we'd prepared. "All HOA actions against accessibility modifications in Willow Creek Estates are suspended pending investigation." The bulldozer operator hastily shut down his machine, removing his keys and backing away from the equipment. "I was just following orders," he muttered to one of the inspectors. "They told me all the paperwork was in order." Victoria's composure completely collapsed. "This is absurd! You tricked me. You never said you worked for the state." "You never asked," I replied calmly. "And more importantly, it shouldn't matter. Every resident deserves the right to access their home safely, regardless of who they are or who they know." As the state inspectors began documenting the damage and interviewing neighbors, Victoria retreated to her SUV, frantically making phone calls. The news crew was capturing everything, including Mr. Diaz, showing the inspector his folder of HOA violation notices for his wife's oxygen equipment. Within hours, our quiet neighborhood controversy had transformed into a state-level investigation that would ultimately change housing rights across Colorado. But that morning, standing amid the broken concrete of my grandmother's ramp, I had no idea how far the ripples would spread or how many lives would be transformed by Victoria Palmer's biggest mistake. Because when the State Disability Commissioner returned home that afternoon with his grandmother, It wasn't just to a damaged ramp, it was to the beginning of a revolution in how HOAs throughout Colorado would treat their most vulnerable residents. The crowd of neighbors grew as word spread through Willow Creek Estates. Mrs. Thompson brought coffee for the state inspectors while they photographed the destroyed ramp. Mr. Diaz had organized a small army of residents who were eager to share their stories with the investigators. Victoria remained in her SUV, occasionally visible through the tinted windows as she made frantic calls. Sophia approached me as I helped Grandma navigate the broken edge of what remained of her ramp. "We've got enough for an immediate injunction," she whispered, "but there's something else you should see." She handed me her tablet, displaying financial records from Willow Creek Estates HOA. "We fast-tracked the subpoena while you were keeping her occupied. Look at these expenditures." The numbers told a damning story. Over $200,000 in architectural compliance enforcement paid directly to Palmer Construction Services in the past year alone. Another $75,000 for landscaping restoration to a company called VP Designs, which a quick search revealed was registered to Victoria's sister. "She's been using HOA funds as her personal ATM," I murmured, scrolling through page after page. "Of suspicious transactions." Grandma peered over my shoulder, her expression hardening. "All those increased dues last year that she claimed were for community improvements went straight to her family businesses," Sophia finished. "Classic embezzlement scheme." The news crew was interviewing the Patels now, who were explaining how Victoria had forced them to remove their father's wheelchair lift, then recommended her husband's company to install a compliant alternative at triple the market rate. "James," Sophia said quietly, "we need to address the media. This is bigger than just disability discrimination now." I nodded, helping Grandma back inside. Before joining Sophia near the news van, the reporter, a young woman named Aisha Jefferson, eagerly positioned her microphone as her cameraman adjusted his equipment. "Commissioner Wilson, can you explain what's happening here today?" I straightened my tie, conscious that my next words would likely be broadcast across Colorado. What began as a straightforward accessibility issue has uncovered what appears to be a pattern of discriminatory practices and potential financial impropriety within the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. Our office is committed to investigating these matters fully and ensuring that all Colorado residents can access their homes safely and without discrimination, regardless of disability status. Sources tell us the HOA president, Victoria Palmer, owns the construction company that was demolishing the ramp. Can you comment on that? The state is investigating all aspects of this situation, including potential conflicts of interest. I cannot comment further on ongoing investigations, but I want to be clear. No HOA agreement can supersede federal disability protections or state housing laws. As I spoke, Victoria finally emerged from her SUV, phone clutched in her hand. She strode toward us, her face a mask of indignation. "This is slander. I demand equal time to respond to these baseless accusations." The cameraman swung toward her as Aisha extended her microphone. "Mrs. Palmer, would you care to explain why you ordered the demolition of a medically necessary wheelchair ramp?" Victoria's training as HOA president had prepared her for dealing with unruly residents and minor compliance issues, not hard-hitting reporters and state investigations. Her composure fractured visibly. The HOA covenant clearly states that all external modifications require board approval. The Wilson family deliberately circumvented our processes by going directly to the city. "Is it true that your husband owns the construction company that was performing today's demolition?" Aisha pressed. Victoria's eyes darted nervously. "Palmer Construction has a standing contract with the HOA for all enforcement actions. Everything is completely above board. And was that contract put out for competitive bidding as required by Colorado HOA transparency laws? That's not. You'll need to speak with our HOA attorney. The reporter pressed further. Multiple residents have told us they were forced to remove disability accommodations, then recommended to hire Palmer Construction for compliant alternatives. How do you respond to allegations that you've been using HOA enforcement to generate business for your family companies? Victoria's face flushed. This interview is over. She turned and stalked back toward her vehicle. The afternoon descended into organized chaos as more officials arrived. The county building inspector confirmed that our ramp had been properly permitted. The State Housing Authority began reviewing HOA financial records in the community clubhouse. 2 officers from the Financial Crimes Unit showed up to interview Victoria, who by then had called her attorney. Throughout it all, neighbors continued to emerge with documentation of their own struggles with Victoria's reign. The elderly couple from the corner had a 3-inch binder of violation notices about their grandson's medical equipment. The young family with the autistic son shared emails from Victoria threatening liens over their sensory-friendly yard modifications. Even board members began distancing themselves, claiming they'd been misled about the legality of their actions. By evening, temporary repairs had made the remaining portion of Grandma's ramp usable, though it would need complete reconstruction. Victoria's attorney had negotiated her cooperation with investigators in exchange for being allowed to go home. Rather than to the station for questioning, the news crews had finally departed after promising follow-up coverage. As dusk settled over the neighborhood, something remarkable happened. Mr. Diaz appeared at our door with a casserole. Behind him stood at least 20 neighbors, some I barely recognized, all carrying food, folding chairs, and determined expressions. "We're having an emergency neighborhood meeting," Mr. Diaz announced. "Right here, if that's okay with you and Miss Maggie." Within an hour, our backyard had transformed into an impromptu town hall. Grandma sat in her wheelchair near the damaged ramp, accepting hugs and words of support from people who had previously been too intimidated by Victoria to even make eye contact. Mrs. Thompson, who'd lived in Willow Creek for over a decade, stood with tears in her eyes. "I've been afraid to put up a railing by my front steps for 3 years, even though I've fallen twice. Victoria said it would make the neighborhood look like a nursing home." Mr. Patel nodded. "She fined us $100 per day when my father visited, because his oxygen concentrator was unsightly equipment on our porch." One by one, neighbors shared their stories. Accessibility needs denied, reasonable accommodations rejected, exorbitant fines leveraged until they gave up or paid Palmer Construction for approved alternatives. The web of financial and emotional manipulation Victoria had woven throughout our community became increasingly clear. Sophia, who had stayed to help coordinate the state's response, sat beside me taking notes. "This goes beyond Willow Creek," she whispered. "If this is happening here, it's happening in HOAs across Colorado." The next morning brought a flurry of developments. Victoria's attorney issued a statement claiming she had simply been enforcing the community standards as written and had no knowledge of any financial improprieties. The HOA board announced an emergency session to review all pending violation notices. The State Attorney General's office called requesting a briefing on our findings. Most surprising was the call from the construction company that had demolished our ramp. Steve Johnson, the bulldozer operator, wanted to volunteer his services to rebuild it, properly this time, and at no cost. "I had no idea what was really going on," he explained, voice heavy with regret. "Mrs. Palmer told us you were violating code and endangering the neighborhood. I've got a cousin with cerebral palsy who uses a wheelchair. I never would have touched that ramp if I'd known the truth." Over the next few days, state investigators continued to unravel Victoria's scheme. They discovered she had systematically targeted residents with disabilities or medical needs, using violation notices and fines to either force them out or coerce them into hiring Palmer Construction. The financial records revealed over $800,000 in questionable transactions over the past 4 years, all benefiting companies connected to Victoria's family members. Meanwhile, something extraordinary was happening throughout Willow Creek Estates. Neighbors who had barely spoken before were forming support networks. The Thompsons organized a meal train for Grandma while her ramp was being reconstructed. The young couple from down the street offered their accessible van for transportation. Mr. Diaz and several retired residents formed a committee to review the HOA bylaws and propose amendments. 1 week after the bulldozer incident, we held a community rebuilding day. Over 50 residents showed up with tools, supplies, and determination. Steve Johnson brought his crew and materials donated by local businesses. Together, they constructed not just a replacement ramp, but a beautiful, gently sloping pathway that blended seamlessly with Grandma's garden. Solar lights were reinstalled, even prettier than before, and Mrs. Patel's daughter painted cheerful flowers along the concrete edges. As I watched this transformation, Sophia joined me on the porch. The Attorney General wants to use Willow Creek as a test case for new HOA regulations, she said. They're proposing legislation to strengthen disability protections in community governance. I nodded, watching as Mr. Diaz and his wife carefully planted flowers along the path, while the Thompson children eagerly helped water them. We need to go further, I said. This isn't just about disability rights. It's about community empowerment versus tyranny disguised as property values. A month later, Victoria Palmer accepted a plea deal on multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and civil rights violations. She and her husband were required to pay full restitution to the HOA and affected residents. They quietly sold their home and moved away, reportedly to Arizona, where Victoria's sister lived. The Willow Creek HOA underwent a complete restructuring. The new board, led by Mr. Diaz and Mrs. Thompson, established a resident accessibility committee with Grandma as honorary chairperson. Their first action was to approve funding for accessibility modifications throughout the neighborhood, ramps, railings, and other accommodations that had previously been denied. More importantly, our experience became the catalyst for state-level change. Working with the Attorney General and state legislature, I helped draft the Community Housing Accessibility and Transparency Act, or CHAT. The legislation established clear protections for disability accommodations in HOA-governed communities, implemented financial oversight requirements, and created pathways for residents to challenge discriminatory practices. 6 months after Victoria's bulldozer tore apart our ramp, I stood at a podium in the state capitol as the governor signed CHAT into law. Grandma sat beside me in her wheelchair, beaming with pride as cameras flashed. This law won't just protect people with disabilities, the governor said. It protects the very concept of what home means, a place where everyone has the right to live with dignity, safety, and independence. Afterward, back in our transformed neighborhood, we held a celebration in the community park. What had once been Victoria's prized flower garden, maintained with HOA funds and off-limits to residents, had been converted into an accessible playground with equipment suitable for children of all abilities. As dusk fell, neighbors gathered on blankets and lawn chairs, sharing food and stories. The animosity and fear that had characterized Willow Creek under Victoria's regime had been replaced by genuine community bonds. I watched as Mrs. Thompson helped Grandma navigate the smooth pathway through the playground, while Mr. Diaz's grandchildren raced wheelchairs borrowed from the new neighborhood lending program. Sitting there under the stars, surrounded by people who had transformed from intimidated individuals into a supportive community, I had a profound realization. Victoria Palmer had tried to bulldoze a ramp, but she had inadvertently built something far more powerful, a bridge connecting people who had been isolated by fear. Her attempt to enforce conformity had sparked a revolution of compassion. The physical ramp to Grandma's house had been rebuilt, stronger and more beautiful than before. But the greater accessibility we'd created wasn't made of concrete. It was built from connection, understanding, and the courage to stand together against injustice. As I looked around at the transformed faces of my neighbors, I understood that the most important thing we'd constructed wasn't a pathway for wheelchairs, but a community where everyone could truly belong. And that, I realized, was what home was always supposed to be. Up next, you got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.